Welcome to Austen Mondays, everyone. I am your host, Edward G. Pettit from the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And for 24 weeks, we're going on a biblio-venture with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In each episode, I'll talk with a special guest, a brilliant Austen scholar, creator, or Janeite about Austen and her works. And then I'll have an hour-long conversational annotation with a chapter co-host in which we illuminate, elucidate, explicate a few chapters of Pride and Prejudice. And we have two special guests joining us tonight for the Turn About the Room segment. And that is Casey MacMillan and Jessica Bedford. You guys can jump on at any time, whether you are, and you can unmute too. And welcome to both of you. Jessica, it's a pleasure to have you join us.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Good. Casey, as always, I love having you here. It's been an entire week since we've done this together.
I know. Happy to be here again and very happy to share this experience with my dear friend, Jessica Bedford.
Good. So usually people, you're used to seeing Casey as a co-host doing the chapter annotation. Well, she's taking a turn about the room with us tonight with her good friend, Jessica.
It's so refreshing.
Good. More with Casey and Jessica in a moment. And everyone stay tuned for that chapter annotation segment when Casey will remain with me to talk about chapters 24 to 27. Everyone Goes to London. Or if you're reading the book that's divided into volumes, it's volume 2, chapters 1 to 4. There you go. If you're watching live on YouTube right now, or if you're watching the recording sometime in the future, I invite you to please like the video and also subscribe to the channel. Doing that gives our show greater visibility and leads to more people discovering Austen Mondays. But let's get on with today's show. For the Turn About the Room, please welcome Casey MacMillan and Jessica Bedford. Casey, as I mentioned, is one of our regular co-hosts on Austen Monday. She's also the producing artistic director of Philadelphia Theater Tiny Dynamite, where she directed and co-created the smash hit The Complete Works of Jane Austen Abridged in 2019. She's also the director of more than 50 productions in regional theater and off-Broadway and at the Rosenbach, where she did The Vampire's Mystery, Notes on a Monster this past Halloween. And she's also the artistic director of Inish Nua Theater Company. So several hats to wear for KC. And Jessica Bedford is a Philadelphia-based actor, director, dramaturg, playwright, and teacher. She's been seen on stage at the McCarter Theater, Walnut Street Theater, Lantern, Tiny Dynamite, People's Light and Theater, and so many other stages in the Philadelphia area. Recent directing credits include Delaware Shakespeare, the Philadelphia Artists Collective, Act Two Playhouse, DeSales University, the McCarter, PA Shakespeare Festival. And as a writer, her works have been produced with many theaters as well, including Tiny Dynamite and this Complete Works of Jane Austen Abridged. Currently, Jessica is an assistant professor of theater as well at DeSales University. So you've also got a ton of hats. This is theater people, right?
That's the thing. We do that. We like the hyphens. Yeah.
Many hats, many sources of, support.
Yeah.
in the arts. Yeah. All righty. Well, this is great. Jessica, it's a question I ask everybody, and Casey has answered this question. So we'll start with you for this one. And that is, do you have an Austen, or particularly Pride and Prejudice, if you do, an Austen discovery moment in your life? Did that happen?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me with Austen, as for many people, it was Pride and Prejudice first. I remember being such a nerd in high school that I really liked to save my homework for that first hour when I was home from school. So I used to use my study hall to read novels. And I know, yeah. And I had never read Pride and Prejudice, so I decided to. And it's one of those experiences where it was like, I remember the book just like hitting me in all the feels and being so satisfying that like I can still see like my study hall desk on the other side of like the page, like because it was that impactful for me. Just the humor of it, the wit of it, just how well written it was, and Yeah, just that experience of being a young person and encountering a character that feels like you in a way is pretty special. And then I got to do a few stage adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, in fact, three at three different theaters.
Wow.
And I played Jane every time. And one of the things about it, in terms of like having to live her from the inside out, that gave me such an appreciation for the way Austen specifically crafts characters, was that I just had this big aha moment where I was like, how do you just be good? Like, just be Jane and be good and be Jane and be good and just be good. It's so boring. It's so inactive. And what I realized is that for Jane, particularly actually in the conversation that happened just before the chapters that you're encountering tonight, where she and Lizzie are alone and really processing that Bingley is not coming back, where it's like, oh, goodness is a choice for her. Like, she's as smart as Lizzie. She sees both sides of the coin. She just chooses to look at the world through her specific lens because it's what brings her the most peace. And I was like, oh, there it is. That's how you make a character and a soul like this active. And oh my gosh, Jane Austen, aren't you brilliant? You know? Yeah.
Did you discover that the first time you played her, or was it until the second or third?
It was the first time, but I have to admit it was in the run. It wasn't in the rehearsal, it was in the run. And then, I just started devouring a lot of Austen from there. Sense and Sensibility became a great favorite. Emma, of course, Emma. Yeah. So
Did you were you upset at all? Maybe thought you were going to be typecast as like did you because when you first read it and you so identified with Lizzie, was there any kind of emotional attachment or any kind of idea that like, wait, I'm not Jane, I'm Lizzie?
Oh, no, I think I was just so excited that I was going to get to do it, that I was going to get to be a part of the story, that I was like, sure, where do you want me? Right? Like, I'll play anybody. Lady Lucas got it here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And wear those costumes besides,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Jessica, that I could text you when we're done, but we'll use this public forum. Something I've been thinking about recently and thinking about in terms of the chapters we'll talk about in a little bit is like, where does Jane come from as a child of the Bennets? As someone who's like lived in it, do you have any thoughts on it? Because like, yeah, goodness is a choice. No one else in that family is making that choice. Like, where does that, thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, not to get too Freudian about this, but I do think that we tend to, as human creatures, either form ourselves like the people who raise us, or we form ourselves in reaction against. And I sort of think that like she loves her mother dearly, but says, not that worldview. Like, I'm gonna live over here, Yeah.
I wonder. I don't know if the novel gives us an answer to that, and I wonder if it's, but it's also not just especially when you have multiple children, as I know full well, that some of them are like you and some of them aren't, and like I'm nothing. Like I didn't, like in my own family, I'm the odd one. I don't, think like other people that I grew up in a household with, and.
Right.
And so, Jane, who knows where she got, but she is the anomaly in that family, right?
Right. She's just a bit of an unconventional
No,
aunt.
Mary is too. Mary is too. Mary's nothing like anyone else. So, she does the book thing, and maybe she pulls that from her dad, but then she's taken it an entirely different way.
I think I would argue that Mary actually has quite a bit in common with Mr. Bennet. She just didn't get a sense of humor.
Yeah.
That's really a tragedy, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
All of Mr. Bennet's rejection of the values of others in the house with none of the attraction of personality. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Bless her.
Well, both of you were involved with creating this Jane Austen, the complete works of Jane Austen abridged show, along with Megan Winch and Charlotte Northeast. And how did you first approach taking, it's not even like taking one book and like, how do we adapt this? It was, how do we talk about all of the works of Austen? How does that come about?
Well, So I'll start, and then Jessica, you alley-oop off me. So the original collaborative team, which I brought together, I'd had this title in my head, The Complete Works of Jane Austen Abridged, and didn't know what to do with it, except believing that someone should do something with it. And so I decided, well, let me bring in the Janeite actor, creator, writers that I trust, and let's make a thing. But the original team was composed of Jessica and Charlotte, as you mentioned, and also a British expat actor here in Philadelphia named Harry Smith. For those out there listening who've seen it, and I know there are actually a couple hundred who have, the first scene of the play is Charlotte asks Jessica, where's Harry? Harry Smith, our friend, in this play with us right now. Harry took a couple months into our writing process. Harry booked some out of town work as an actor that, being an actor, he had to take. And so it really shook up the whole nature of the process. So that's the start. I boop it to Jessica.
Oh, that was my whoop. Oh, sorry. This is my whoop.
You're slam dunking it. Go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah. So when Harry took this job in New York, which was just too good to walk away from, we sort of went like, where do we go from here? And it occurred to us like, okay, this is Austen. We do need a dude, preferably one who looks rather fetching in some tailcoats and high boots. And there's this actor named Trevor Fail in town that we all just liked working with, just a good person, a good human. And we thought, let's invite him into the room. And the opportunity that gave us was Trevor knew absolutely nothing about Jane Austen. So the show sort of morphed from there, where it became, how do we teach this person about the glory of Jane Austen, right? And that really opened up the experience, I think, in terms of our thinking about what we could deliver for the audience. How do we bring along the Janeites, and also the Janeite who has brought along her friend who hates Jane Austen? How do we pull them along as well? So we wrote for about a year and a half, maybe a little bit more, then premiered it with Tiny Dynamite, and it's been running ever since. We do tackle every play of Jane Austen. We even tackle the juvenilia and some of the unfinished work, and everything is sort of broken down and given its own little satirical treatment of it.
Yeah. And I mean, I saw the stream of it. I didn't get to see it live. It's unlike adapting just a novel and figuring out, which scenes to use. This was, in doing all of them, it also takes on that, because it's a play not just about, these particular works, but it's also about the idea of Jane Austen. Did that come into play, that you knew you were doing a show about Austen with the big capital A?
Certainly. We were interested in the idea as women creators, and just to clarify, bringing in Trevor as the third character really was helpful in clarifying what the shape of the piece could be. But we didn't bring him on as a writer. It was still woman-led, and in so doing, our dramaturg Megan Winch sort of became a co-writer instead. So it was for women, and so one of the things we've found ourselves wanting to talk about is that, yes, these are coming of age stories in many cases, and yes, they are romances, but they're also treat on the ironies and follies of human life, something that interests me always as a director, and very much they deal in female friendship, female relationship, and in some cases, the primacy of women's relationships to the love relationship. And that was really important to us, and I think shaped by the relationships between the writers themselves. So before we even started writing treatments of the novels, and sort of the four of us each kind of took our favorite and went off in a corner and here, I made a thing for you, my friends. The first scenes that came out, I think, for all of us, isn't this right, Jessica? We're scenes about our conversations about Jane Austen as a whole, what she meant to us, what we think means to the world.
Yeah, I had a teacher recently dismiss Austen as marriage plot material, and I was like, what? 3 definitely had to sort of like, address that. Yeah.
My answer to that's always yes. And
Yes, and
there's so much more there, clearly.
It was really dismissive. I was very hot under the collar.
And I have no qualms about just, the whole marriage plot thing is, I think, brilliant to work with, and to see how Austen uses that and does that, what she has to say about it.
And
Were there
and is one of the most important aspects of all human life and relationships. Not saying that marriage is for everyone, but the finding your person, and in so doing finding who you are. This is one of the most significant experiences that most of us of the species have. Why do we make that small?
Yeah. The so but you said you also kind of all had your, like, not, did you all have your favorites that you then got to work on and bring to people? And who got to do Pride and Prejudice? You did? Wow. Okay. Was that like a trump? Did you play that as your trump card? Like, haha, I get Pride and Prejudice.
No, actually, I think it was a fairly easy decision to make. That it was like, but that was like a blessing and well, not a curse, but it was a little bit challenging, where it's like we're taking these pieces that are like our favorite and distilling, reducing, and satirizing, and it was like,
Yeah.
It took forever, I think, for me to turn out Pride and Prejudice. I also had like a couple of ideas that just didn't hit at first either. So it was like, by the time we got to something, it's kind of actually really difficult to take a piece that is so beloved and so dear to you. It was a little bit of a lesson where I was like, okay, if I'm going to adapt something in the future, I think it's a good thing to just like really like it versus like, I love it.
Yeah.
Especially knowing the audience, especially knowing there's Janeites out there. So this is that true then? You had to make sure that this adaptation, you didn't like take, normally would you take the audience into account in doing an adaptation? And did you want to specifically take that into account for this one?
Oh yeah, we knew the audience was going to come to this knowing their stuff. And so we had to sort of get it right. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's sort of the thing I want to, since we've used satirize a couple times, that feels important. Never mockery of Jane Austen,
Oh no.
We took the liberties of treating her like a best friend, which felt like liberty enough. But whatever satirizing we did of the material itself was done with love and deep understanding of a reader who, for example, this comes up a number of times. It comes up in Jessica's Pride and Prejudice, is you get to the hottest moment. You get to the moment where the characters express their love for each other, and she goes into full narration, and it makes me want to die. So we're satirizing as much our relationship as readers of the material than Jane Austen herself. And it's done with the playfulness that only sort of like deep reverence can give, So, and knowing too that, okay, that's most of our audience as well. But of course, like Trevor being a stand-in for people who don't know anything about Austen became our way of, and bring friends and introduce them to this world, because every joke we give you, there's going to be the deep cut layer that I use the Maryland Jasna chapter as an example, because they came to our first run of the show in 2019, and I sat them all in the same row, and they spent most of the play doubled over as a unit. Hi, Jasna Maryland, I hope you're here. There's going to be jokes that like the deep cuts that super Janeites are going to get, and then we give a little like secondary, some little like aftershocks of humor to explain to the people who are looking around wondering why half the people are laughing, like what just happened. So we are consciously aware of like who the audience is at multiple levels. I think every theater artist has to be.
With Austen too, and I know you had this in mind. Maybe you could talk about how this worked. That it's not just the books with Austen. It is also, as we talked about, it's the BBC adaptation. It's the the Ang Lee film, Emma Thompson written, Sense and Sensibility, like those are also Austen to the audience, and you have to take that into account as well, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. For sure. We have, a wet shirt tribute moment. We have, right. Yeah, we have a reference to the Keira Knightley. Yeah.
I called when we talked about the BBC Pride and Prejudice, I called it Darcy's Wet Shirt as a title on YouTube, and it is fast becoming the most watched video of this entire and I clearly chose the right title for it. Like, Darcy's Wet Shirt is going to get hits. So there you go.
Good job, Ed.
Little tip for people there doing your own little rinky-dink YouTube show like we are. Get a good title.
I think one of the things too about like these sort of like Austen inside jokes and things like that is that, like, I don't know, in writing it, I felt a very like, our girl's funny. She's funny. She would be all right with us being, having a good sense of humor about her. In fact, I think she would want that. So
well,
yeah.
And especially as you mentioned the satirizing instead of just outright mockery, because that is the kind of comic artist that Austen is, right? That it's primarily satire when she's funny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I'm thinking of a moment Megan Winch, our partner, wrote the treatment for Sense and Sensibility, and there's a scene in which, Edward shows up and Eleanor says, "Oh, we didn't know you were coming." And Edward's response is, "You didn't tell us you were coming." And his response is, "No one in these books ever does." And that's about like the most savage will go in teasing Jane Austen, when she herself, based on her letters, can be far sharper than we ever were. Yeah. I don't know, Davey, can you think of another moment that was like, ooh, we took her to task? I can't really think of one.
Yeah, we're no Lady Susan. We don't go Lady Susan. No. Yeah.
For those who don't know, Lady Susan is an earlier work. Hey, there's the boy. Is an earlier work.
He's like, I am my friend
Austen,
Jessica.
In which the satire is pretty savage. And made into the film Love and Friendship, directed by Whit Stillman. So, who we had at the Rosenbach, and I got to interview him for a public program when that film was out. Whenever it came out, I don't know, was that 2016, something like that, 2017?
Something like that. Yeah. I like that film. I like Kate Beckinsale. It's fun to watch. I don't know. It's given that she once played Emma, right? It's for me, it's also fun to watch actresses age and what's expected of us and what we do with that. Watching her go from Emma to Lady Susan, I don't know, feels like some kind of commentary on what women are given to do.
That trajectory feels right, doesn't it? Like if somebody went from like, oh gosh, like Eleanor to Lady Susan, you'd be like, no. But Emma to Lady Susan feels right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I agree.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, buddy, go away.
Jessica, you're also directing a production of Sense and Sensibility that'll come up next summer at the Pennsylvania Shakespeare Festival.
This summer, July. This was a production that I was supposed to direct back in 2020. And then the world hit the great pause, and so that did not happen. So I'm really pleased to see that it's gonna go this time. It's gonna get to fly. Yeah.
What are the particular challenges as you see it in that? Then that's a single work. This is an Austen work, plot, characters. How do you think of bringing that to the stage?
I think the challenge of directing any of these good adaptations, this is a particularly great one by Jessica Swalley out of the UK, is all the locations and how do you deal with that? Because like you can't like just change scenery the way you can in film that quickly, right? Like we have a tight, just under 2 hours to get this story told, and how many different locations. So how do you keep the story moving while also like signifying to the audience that a change has happened, that we're in a different place and things like that. That's the biggest.
And this is something, I mean, you can look to Shakespeare for this easily, I guess, right? I mean, I think of Antony Cleopatra especially, where it's like 3 different continents or 2 different continents, and
right.
Like so many, like every scene, it's like the most filmic in that, and that every scene is like a cut to another place.
Yeah.
And you have to portray that. as opposed to when you see films of Austen, they can really bring in the countryside and that nostalgia and that British heritage kind of thing.
Right.
Is there any way you can do that in a stage show, or is it just set design that you have to give people the impression of these places?
It's interesting that you say like Shakespeare, because like Shakespeare, there is conveniently a lot of language at Barton Cottage is this, right? And so all of a sudden that tells the audience we are in a new place. We are at Barton Cottage. I have found less set design, although set design is key. I don't mean to minimize it, but in terms of telling the story of the change of location, it's lighting that is our friend. So we can like just have them move to a different part of the stage. The lights kind of change, travel, morph with them. The language says, here we are at Barton Cottage, and boom, here we are.
We're in motion, that the transitions themselves. Yeah, I agree. I did an adaptation of Emma some years ago. And I think unlike Shakespeare, right, you're competing with the cinematic experiences that people have had in the adaptations. Those are in their minds. And so to try and find that with the tools of the stage, you're only going to come up short. You have to use the things that are unique to us, and something that cinema doesn't do in quite the ways that theater can is the transitions themselves from place to place can be beautiful. So yeah, I absolutely concur. You have to choose like some other way, some strong metaphor for telling the story visually, because you just can't compete with, Ang Lee's budget, for example.
Yeah. But the thing that is amazing about seeing a piece of Austen live in the theater, I have to say, is like, okay, we all love the moment from the Sense and Sensibility movie adaptation where Eleanor's alone and lets herself cry for the first time. Like, just imagine seeing an Eleanor experiencing those emotions, and you're only like 5 feet from her. Like, you're in the room with that. It has a different thrill.
Yeah, I agree. When you're in the room with it, you can even feel her holding the emotion in a way that on film just looks like stillness, right? Yeah, it's exciting stuff.
You have to play against that film, though, Jessica. Does that knowing that an audience has an expectation of they've seen that you have to take that into account and make sure you do it in a way because they've already seen something. So, and they've seen it like multiple times in their house on video over and over again.
Well, as well they should, because it's smashing, right? Yeah. No, I don't feel that way, and maybe this is naive and dumb of me, but I'll say that, like, one of the things that I appreciate myself, being such a lover of Austen, is that, like, I'm always excited to see the new iteration of one of the stories that I love and hold dear. And so I trust that when a Janeite comes, they are also living in that world, that they're excited to see, how does this story hold in this context with these actors, with this design. In fact, my set designer, who's rather moved by the Ang Lee film, keeps talking to me about, and I love this, about being set unit pieces. And he's like, and we're going to pull in some of the molding. Don't worry, we'll get some of the molding from around the window in the Ang Lee. We'll have the molding. So anybody who's coming, look out for the molding, because it's our little comment to the Ang Lee, Emma Thompson Sense and Sensibility. But yeah, no, I think it's great if they come loving that film and loving this story. Please do. Let's show you a different side and a different version of it. I think it won't disappoint.
Excellent. Thank you. We said a little bit of a tale just going by there. Yeah.
He is so against me being in this Zoom meeting right now. That's why it's just the arm. You're just going to see me. I'm stiff arming him. Yeah.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much for joining us and taking a turn about the room with us tonight. Casey's going to hang on here, but I absolutely look forward to seeing your Sense and Sensibility in the and you're not in it. You're just directing it. Is that
just directing it? Yeah.
All righty.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been great fun. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks.
Love you, friend. Kiss your babies.
Love you too. I will. Bye.
Bye, Jessica. Casey, somebody did have a question for you in particular about Innishnua. Is Innishnua where you're where you're also artistic director. Does it produce Irish plays? Is the question. I know the answer, so that's why they want to know. What does Inishnua do?
Picking up on the Gaelic there, I see. Thank you. Yeah, Inishnua is Gaelic for New Ireland, which is, North America where we're sitting. Yes, Inishnua's a Philadelphia theater company. Our focus is contemporary plays from Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales. So yes, there's a great love for Irish drama, and I am obviously sitting here in this room an Anglophile as well. So and there's a lot of really thrilling theatrical work coming out of Scotland and Wales too, in a smaller scale because Wales is smaller. But yeah, it's a really thrilling and I think a timely mission for having the conversations that are happening here on our own shores and here in our own community being echoed by international voices. So yeah.
Great. Well, we have so many venues to look forward to your work going on, including Jane Eyre in the spring.
Including Jane Eyre, co-written by Jessica Bedford. It was the same writing team of Jane Austen Abridged. We were commissioned a few years ago to do an all original adaptation of Bronte's Jane Eyre, not a satirical one, like a theatrical,
good,
straight as you will adaptation.
I like that. So, all right, everyone. Next week, Patricia A. Matthew will join us for a turnabout the room to talk about how Austen gets reimagined for 21st century audiences, and things like some of these new novels that are coming out, like Pride and Protest. They're the kinds of things we're going to be talking about. I really look forward to that. Let me take this moment, everyone, to thank you all for watching the episode. As a nonprofit organization, the Rosenbach Museum and Library depends on the generosity of friends and supporters like you to keep programs like this free and accessible to hundreds of fellow Austen lovers worldwide. If you would like to donate to the Rosenbach, you can do so at our website. You could also become a member. Membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to member-only events. You can learn more about how to become a member on our website. And at the end of today's show, I'll give a shout out to all those who have donated or joined as members since last week's episode, including someone from Australia. Lots of great in-person and virtual programs and courses at the Rosenbach coming up. Our new winter programs and course schedule is now available on our website for everyone to register. Usually at this time of the show, I'll start sharing slides and things because I'm promoting the chapter co-host to come up, and I don't have to do that today. I could just tell you all to go to rosenbach.org and find the great programs and courses we have coming up there, including one not new for the winter schedule, but a Shakespeare course that begins on December 15th, in just a little over a week now, taught by Dr. Jim Casey, and it's called Shakespeare and the Fantastic. And it is a reading course in which we'll do, in which he'll cover The Tempest, Hamlet, Macbeth, Midsummer Night's Dream. There might be another. I think that's it, though. I think maybe it's those four. And if it's five, I'm forgetting one. And I can't wait for this. I'm actually going to sit in on this course. I'm really going to enjoy doing some Shakespeare work with Jim Casey. Austen Mondays merchandise is still available. We have t-shirts, stickers, and buttons. You can visit the Rosenbach's website also to buy that, and join us on our Facebook group page that we have called Austen Mondays for lots more info, news, links, conversation, and fun. But right now, let me mention what I am drinking in our Drinking with Jane and Ed segment. And today, my drink in honor of the wonderful couple that we'll have in today is called the Gardiners of Gracechurch Street. Look, it's almost done. I've already drank almost an entire one. It was like a little pre-show too, but I've made enough to top it off. And it's gin, triple sec, cucumber, and mint. And actually, so there's cucumber and mint in there as well. But what I did is I cut a little piece of cucumber and put that in the cocktail shaker along with the mint and ice, and I shake them up together. I always do that with a cucumber drink. and give that nice cucumber dip. But that orange and the triple sec and the mint and the cucumber all together and the gin, it's really very tasty. And only just as I think you'll agree with me, Casey, I love the Gardiners, and I think they deserve a tasty, flavorful drink to toast them.
Sounds a little Pim's Cup adjacent. Is that the flavor profile?
It could be, but well, the Pim's Cup is a bit bitter and flavor. So yeah, so it's a bit like that. And usually with a Pim's Cup, my Pim's Cup, it's a lot of gin too. Like I really like, even though Pim's number one is already a gin based aperitif, I like to throw in gin as well. So but we had a Darcy drink that had Pim's in it earlier this year. So
no, it sounds beautiful. I, as I've said before on this program, don't do spirits midweek, but being a hopeless member of the bourgeoisie, this year I did sign up for a wine tasting advent calendar.
Oh, there you go.
This was yesterday. It's just a Chardonnay in a little plastic bottle.
You don't do spirits during the week. I'm reminded of that. Robert Mitchum was, I think it might be on the Dick Cavett show. He told the story. Somebody he was like, oh, let's go out. And it was in the afternoon, like go have a drink with lunch. And then somebody said, I don't drink in the daytime. And Mitchum said, half your life is in the daytime. And which I would say, like, are you kidding me? Like 5/7 of your life is during the week. So yeah, I couldn't give up drinking during the week.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I didn't give up drinking. Yeah.
But even spirits. Yeah.
We had the MacMillan household had a very different policy in the first 3 months of the pandemic. There was a lot of cocktail experimentation every day, and then 20 pounds to take off in the next 3 months. So.
I outgrew all my clothes. Yeah. It's all booze weight. So definitely. So, and I just ordered 2 new tweed suits. So, cause even the 2 that I had custom made are pretty snug. So yeah, but of course then I was putting together shows that featured cocktails. We did with Dracula and Frankenstein first, and I centered my work life in this one too around let's come up with a cocktail to drink every week. So all right, but right now what we are going to do is talk about the novel, and this is chapters 24 to 27. Everyone goes to London. But actually, in going over these chapters again, I realized that I gave the drink title this name, but I probably could have called this episode The Gardiners of Gracechurch Street, because I like their place in this, and especially Aunt Gardiner and how she kind of suddenly comes into this novel to influence what we think about what's going on. But everybody's in London. The Bingleys are in London. Jane's already gone to London. Elizabeth will now go to London. Are you ready to go to London, Casey? That's where we're going to go.
I'm always ready to go to London.
Well, the chapter 24 begins with a letter from London that Miss Bingley, Caroline Bingley, has finally written back to Jane and put an end to doubt. And then specifically and she writes to Jane about her brother's regret at not having had time to pay his respects to his friends in Herefordshire before he left the country. And then the next paragraph is, hope was entirely over. That Caroline Bingley has definitely stated in this letter that Bingley's not coming back. And one of the things I really like in this beginning of this chapter here is that we get Jane and Elizabeth talking about this issue and issues of marriage and how to court and all this kind of stuff in ways, in a sense, but also it's interesting because with the letter that Jane shares with Elizabeth, Elizabeth is almost like the reader's representative in this. Like, we also see how awful Caroline Bingley is and her sister, Mrs. Hurst, and how they've shaped, this relationship to move their brother away. Jane doesn't see that, but we do with Elizabeth. And then later we'll have a little bit of a change of that in how Jane sees things that Elizabeth doesn't, that we'll get to. but that's where we are now. That we're in this position where we get Elizabeth's point of view, and we get to see, like Elizabeth says, her heart was divided between concern for her sister and resentment against all the others. And I think it's sentences like that that really bring the reader in and say, yes, me too. I'm very resentful against the Bingley sisters for doing this, especially to Jane's so nice.
Well,
Who is Jane? And we'll get this in this chapter now.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to take a step back to the rationality of dividing your resentment and your love for Jane equally. Just the play off of I don't know, it's yes, I absolutely feel what Lizzie feels in this moment. And I also feel called out by Jane Austen a little bit about it, because there is something what is it? It's right. It comes up in these chapters, the pleasure of seeing yourself the victim of things, that I think like Lizzie, having such a keen mind, indulges in sometimes, of like, I'm going to love being angry about this. I'm going to like indulge in it.
Interesting. Yeah.
That yes, she's absolutely us. And I feel like just as Jane Austen is setting us up to feel that way as readers, and also being like, chill out with your, with your taking quick judgments about things and indulging in them. So yeah, I feel called out by that too, in a sense, even as I feel it. Just we shouldn't trust the pleasure Lizzie takes in this resentment and making villains of people for a couple reasons, right? We shouldn't trust it because in chapter 10, a thing I believe we spoke of earlier, or I had anyway, that came up earlier, is that the very things that Lizzie praised about Charles Bingley, being influenced by friends, caring what they think, succumbing to their wishes, is the very thing she's indulging here in criticizing him for and sinking him low in her esteem. So by Lizzie's own account in chapter 10, we should remember and we should distrust just a little bit this point of view, because she's taking the opposite tack in the very same argument about the very same person.
Because it's also Bingley. It's not just the sisters that she's annoyed with. She says she could not think without anger, hardly without contempt, on that easiness of temper, that want of proper resolution, which now made him, Bingley, the slave of his designing friends. And
she's actively enjoyed disliking Bingley's sisters, Caroline and Mrs. Hurst, before. So yeah, we shouldn't trust objectivity even for them. I also enjoy actively disliking them. I think we're invited to do that.
We are.
But we're given all sorts of little hints here in those first 2 pages of the volume to like, okay, we're not just being told how to feel about these other characters, but note, we're learning things about Lizzie that she can, like flip on her own, not a dime, pence, as it were. She can flip on her own penny about it, her own hay penny.
What do you make of Jane then now too? Because now Jane she's so good that she's going to blame herself and not blame Bingley. That like, I should have, like I didn't give enough, like I didn't show, and we've had this before because we had characters talking about, especially Charlotte and Elizabeth, talking about Jane needs to really show that she really likes this guy, not just like him and hope that he does too, because and this is one of the consequences of it, that Jane feels like she didn't show enough, although as a reader we recognize, especially from other reactions, that she did show, that she was totally in love with him.
Yeah, but was reserved in being flirtatious, being over. Yeah, I'm of two minds of it. I think there's something quite naive, because we know what Caroline is. There's something quite naive in Jane saying, "Oh no, it was just me. I trust in Caroline, and I can't fault Bingley. It was on me to hope." Yeah, that feels really naive based on the things we know. But I also,
well, yeah, that's my question. Is she naive, or does she make specific choices to see people in a particular way?
I think she does. I mean, ringing in my ears is the wisdom of Jessica Bedford. She makes goodness a choice. That I think plays out here. I'm also reminded, I had a personal situation this week with some strife with a friend, and like Lizzie, I was inclined to enjoy taking it rather personally. And my lovely husband Eric suggested, "Hey, what if you look on this system, this situation, accept it with wisdom, take it as information. How can you see people for the limitations that they have?" And then I was reading these chapters to prepare for today. And so I don't know, I'm maybe projecting some wisdom onto Jane.
But does Jane doesn't do that though, does she? Jane thinks, and I don't want to move too far ahead, but Jane, Jane thinks that they are acting, that Bingley's sisters are acting out of good motives.
Oh, and that's nice, right? Yeah, but that's also a choice. But when it comes to Bingley himself, I think she could indulge in feeling sorry for herself, but I think you could read it. I'm not even saying I believe this. You could read it, though, that she is wisely separating her mother's hopes, her own hopes, her sister's hopes for Bingley, and Bingley's actual behavior, right? He didn't propose. She has nothing to regret, to admonish him on that score. Yeah. He singled her out, but he can't be held responsible for all the things her mom wants to happen and all the things, the secrets of her heart wants to happen. So I think, there's plenty that suggests there's naivete here of being like, oh, she just wants what's best for her brother. And I'm sure she knows she's doing wrong or whatever it is, seeing the best in people. But she also doesn't make a villain of Bingley. And I think that's really interesting. Most of Jane Austen's villains are not truly terrible people. They're people who, by virtue of their own needs or insecurities or influences or lack of influences, can be kind of blind to other people's feelings and go about sort of blindly hurting people.
That's interesting. I want to revisit that with you later. I hope we get a chapter we can revisit that, because I think her villains are villains. And
I mean, Wickham's the legit worst.
Well,
right?
hey, we're not gonna spoil. We're not gonna. But it's like, there are characters, and I mean, I think back to Sense and Sensibility, to jump out, like Willoughby is the worst.
He's terrible.
And he's horrible. And redeeming,
and also makes himself
yes, he was in love with Marianne. I don't care. That didn't affect the other women you ruined in your life. The young girls that you ruined in your life. I mean, he's just selfish.
Yeah.
Out for his own.
As a saving grace to what I just let fly, we learn in these chapters that certainly Lizzie treats Wickham with a double standard, and certainly Wickham lets his own needs take primacy over his care of other people. He has shown. How is it different from what Bingley has done with Jane and what Wickham has done with Lizzie? Charles Bingley showed marked attention to Jane and then went a different way. Wickham showed marked attention to Lizzie, and when he becomes interested in a young heiress, she's like, well, you have to take into account.
We'll get to Wickham. Let's deal with Wickham later when we get to Wickham.
I just had to sort of save myself.
Yes. For now, I love this statement of Elizabeth, that she says, the more I see of the world, the more am I dissatisfied with it, and every day confirms my belief of the inconsistency of all human characters and of the little dependence that can be placed on the appearance of either merit or sense. I mean, taken out of context, that's like, oh, that's so pessimistic. That's such a bummer. But that's the attitude, but that's all tied up with that absurdity thing she sees in people, or that she sees in the world, and that she likes to play with and comment on.
Yes, I would even, for me, what's mitigating is the line that comes just before. I don't know, I can bring it up fast enough, but it's, there are very few, I'm going to paraphrase it and you're going to save it for me.
Few people whom I really love, and still fewer whom I think well of whom I think.
To me, that mitigates the absolute pessimism, because there's something in there that says, like, there are very few people I love and fewer still that I think well of, which means, like, we're looking around the Bennet household. There's such a admitting that she can love people and that those people are ridiculous. Yeah. There is something to me deep and and not disappointed or flippant yet. Right.
Yeah.
It's seeing the flaws in your mother for sure and loving her anyway, and your sisters and your father even, and loving them anyway. There is a wisdom in it.
Yeah. She loves everybody, but it's only Jane and her father who she thinks well of. So, and she's only right on one of those two.
Yes, and it seems to me more actively thinking well of Jane here in this chapter than she has before. Not to say she thought ill of Jane, but this taps into the theory I expressed last week about in the adaptations, we get a Lizzie and Jane who are very tight from the beginning. And in the novel, I think what I see is when she has to when she chooses by virtue of her perspective to dismiss intimacy with Charlotte because of Charlotte's marital choices, then it makes more room for Jane to rise in her esteem as being like the bosom friend to whom she's closest. And I feel like we get that in this chapter too, of saying like, you are so good. Almost as if she didn't realize before how good Jane is and has a new appreciation for that. That feels to me, particularly because in this same conversation, they're talking about Charlotte and Charlotte's marriage. That seems to me a contrast. Here it is. Where it is. My dear Jane, this is right at the beginning of chapter 4, about a page and a half in. My dear Jane, exclaimed Elizabeth, you are too good. Your sweetness and disinterestedness are really angelic. I do not know what to say to you. I feel as if I had never done you justice or loved you as you deserve. For me, that this time in this read, I'm not saying it's the truth. It's saying it's Casey's read in here in November, December 2022, that Charlotte has to go away in Lizzie's heart and mind for Jane to rise in this way. And it also echoes a thing that I won't talk about, but this is a moment of, I didn't know you before, Elizabeth says. And that's just, I don't know. I just want to plant a seed and pour water on it of Elizabeth not knowing someone and discovering them will become a thing, I think, or not seeing them clearly and discovering them later.
Well, Elizabeth mentioned Charlotte as well, right after that quote that I gave, and she says 2 instances lately. One I will not mention. The other is Charlotte's marriage. It is unaccountable in every view. It is unaccountable. She has to say that twice.
Is that
at first, I was wondering, like, was the other thing that she's not mentioning Darcy's treatment of Wickham? It doesn't seem to be later in this conversation when Jane asks. It seems to be about Darcy and the Bingley sisters and Bingley, but I can't believe that it's not in Elizabeth's mind that about Darcy's treatment of Wickham. But Jane then asks, like, but then Jane then says, you do not make allowance enough for the difference of situation and temper. This is particularly about Charlotte and Mr. Collins. Consider Mr. Collins' respectability and Charlotte's prudent, steady character. Like, Charlotte needs somebody like this, to marry in her life. And that basically Charlotte and Collins are a good match. And Elizabeth is upset about this because she says, were I persuaded that Charlotte had any regard for him? And then that really, for me, gets into why Elizabeth or Elizabeth's position here. It's not about, like, she wants to break this down. It's like, yes, you can have all this stuff for marriage that you need, but the important thing is you need to have a regard, you need to have a respect, you need to have, it's not even love she's saying. She's talking about regard for him. And Elizabeth is so sure of herself that because Mr. Collins is obviously an idiot, that she can't see beyond that. And Jane can. It's an interesting, point here in this novel where the person who is kind of portrayed as naive and only sees the good side of things, that she sees a side of this that Elizabeth can't see.
Yeah, Elizabeth chooses not to. Whereas in the same conversation, or no, but in the same chapter series, Elizabeth can still make allowances for Wickham making choices that are about material safety. Yeah, it seems to be about prejudice, as it were. And yeah, I think Jane is pursuing this with wisdom. You have to acknowledge that people think differently.
Yeah.
And as for the other situation, I think you're right. Jane interprets that later in this conversation, I believe, right? She says, I know you weren't talking of, you didn't want to pain me by speaking of it, but please don't think ill of Mr. Bingley. But yes, I think you're also right that it seems to be that Darcy's treatment of Wickham, and Darcy's influence on Bingley is turning around in Lizzie's mind.
I think they're tied together in her head here, you know?
Yeah. She seems to enjoy latching on to him as a villain.
And it's interesting too, because, you know, she knows she's right about Mr. Collins, like he's a buffoon. And so she can't see any other reasons why somebody would marry this moron, you know, this like selfish, conceited, toadying, kind of person like that, because she sees him that, and we see it too. And it bears out all the entire novel that she's right about that, but she can't see the other reasons that Charlotte would marry him. And then that also, but she's also going through this thing with Darcy. She also knows she is right about him and how he has treated Wickham, because she's had this story from Wickham. I think we've seen enough of her now, especially all through volume 1, to know that this is her character. This is who Elizabeth is. She's smart enough to interpret other people, but too maybe inexperienced is the word, inexperienced to challenge some of her criteria, some of the data that she's been given, right? That she makes, and I think she makes the correct assessment for the given facts. Like, if Darcy did this, yes, he's a bad guy. Collins is like this, so he is a bad guy. But her prejudice prevents her from seeing her or weighing some of the facts in both situations. Like, she doesn't weigh other factors with Collins. She doesn't weigh what she's found out about Darcy.
Yeah, I love it. I don't know that I, in my mind, characterize it as inexperienced, though of course I'm very aware. Yes, she's 20. But for me, the engine of her mind, it's such a powerful engine. It turns over a lot. And we get to hear, yes, aware that metaphor is limited by the industrial age. Stay with me though. That the engine of her mind turns a lot. And so, yeah, I think she turns over too many times. And I think that's partly why we hear her say things that are contradictory, right? She says, let's not I don't put any stock in the appearance of merit. And yet here, she puts a lot of stock in the appearance of Wickham's merit, to the point that she is forgiving him repeatedly in these chapters for things that she doesn't forgive other people for doing. And in fact, can have no more intimacy with Charlotte for doing the very same thing. And what I can't be sure of is the extent to which the original readers of this novel would have seen the convention of Charlotte's choice as a good thing. I think, and that's knowing, I've read all of the scholarship that says, well, marriage wasn't about love in these times, and marriage, I think, right, we can do a lot of research to believe we knew what the original readers, as heterogeneous in their individual opinions about it would have been. But I do feel a sense of the challenge to the reader of, yeah, he's an imbecile, and that counts. Don't marry someone just for comfort, but also you got to take comfort into account, as Mrs. Gardiner will wisely say too.
Well, I'm gonna put you on the spot. Should Charlotte marry Mr. Collins?
Oh God.
Because I know you've thought about this, and I've thought about this. Should she marry Mr. Collins? As much as we hate him, like he's so awful, but I think Austen and other characters in her novel are really making the case, and Charlotte will too. Now this will become a thing later too, especially next week when Elizabeth goes to visit Charlotte at Hunsford. But I'm going to put you on the spot now and say, should Charlotte marry Mr. Collins?
I say this as someone who came from a lower middle class background, chose a theater life in which my parents could not help me when things got scary. I say this as someone who once put 37 cents worth of gas in her car, found under the mats to get home until my check cleared the next day.
I've done those things. Yeah.
Oh, he's terrible. I think it depends on partly on which Longbourn we're talking about. If we're talking about the BBC Longbourn, yeah. If we're talking about the Joe Wright Longbourn with all the mud and the chickens running around, no, I'm gonna take my chances. I'm taking my chances. That's not an answer, but it made you laugh.
Yeah. I mean, my answer depends on the choice she's making. It's that, which I think is what Austen is putting in, is should Charlotte marry a guy she doesn't love or respect, and then as a result of that get children, good house, respectable life, comfortable life, or should she be an unmarried woman, alone and dependent on her family?
Despised independent. I don't know. I mean,
well, there's a big but in all this. It's what Austen did.
I know.
Austen herself could have married somebody, and instead she was like, no. I know I said yes to you last night, but this morning I'm not going to do it. And she decided that she would not be as happy with this person, or it wouldn't be a good idea with this person. And instead she would have her own life, knowing full well that, especially even by that age, that Austen was going to be an unmarried dependent upon her family.
There's got to be Jaff, right? Jane Austen fan fiction in which Charlotte says no and then goes on to write novels, right? If there isn't, someone out there write it and then send it to me, please. Yeah, it's a circular question. Yeah, I don't know.
I love that I've always puzzled over it, and I always think about it when I read this book, and it's always still as bad as Mr. Collins is, the way Austen has portrayed it here, especially when you take into account their time. It is a very important. It's a very complex question.
If I could throw more data onto the pile that we then light on fire. Also in these chapters, I know I'm getting ahead, Ed, and I know you want to take things chronologically, and I deeply apologize, even as I do it. In these same chapters for tonight, Lizzie can't even stand the conversation of Sir William Lucas. It's worn down. She's heard all the stories. She can't take anymore. There's no pleasure in it. Yeah. Charlotte has lived for 27 years with her
but there is pleasure in it. There's pleasure in the absurdities and hearing him do things, but go ahead.
Yeah, there's pleasure in the absurd. And what she says, something to the effect of but Sir William long ago wore out any of those pleasures for Lizzie. So new theory unshapen. I'm going to shape into existence right now. Lizzie has the advantage of a clever dad that gives her a sense of how to live and what she deserves. And Charlotte has managed 27 years with Sir William Lucas, and we know Charlotte's smart, and we know he is not. So I wonder what skills she has already honed at home for tuning out things she doesn't want to hear anymore, right? It has to have been pretty frustrating to know that your family is in a pretty tight bind financially because your dad made these choices to go become a gentleman, and is kind of a dolt about those choices, and now you're stuck with them all. I don't know. I feel like she's had a long time to get used to how to carve out space in a home where people talk a lot of nonsense.
Yeah. I mean, and this is something that Elizabeth has grown up with. She's grown up with, seeing parents who were unmatched, and how, that's not the life that she wants. So
no,
I think Jane doesn't want it either. I think Jane's on board too with this.
Yes. And I think Jessica in our turnabout the room was right about this too. If sometimes you can form yourself in opposition to the things that you see. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found that very helpful.
All righty. All right, let's go through the rest of the chapter because we have 3 others to do. The Jane can't blame Bingley's sister. She comes back to that now, but she assumes she can't blame them because she assumes they will treat him as she would treat them, and she tells Elizabeth, like, this is just too distressing for like stop talking about this. She says, that she's not even
goodness. Yeah.
She doesn't want to even, continue this, conversation. Do not distress me by the idea that the Bingley sisters may have, motives that are not just for what's best for Charles. Mr. Bennet, of course, thinks all of this is just a ladies' game, like next to being married, he says, he says, so Lizzie, your sister is crossed in love, I find. I congratulate her. Next to being married, a girl likes to be crossed in love a little now and then. Like, maybe it's your turn next, why don't you let it be Wickham? It's all a game for him. Like, but of course that's his experience, right? That's with all the women in his life. That's, that's what he's had happen to the woman that he married and what he watches his daughters do. And it's probably in all the books he reads. And it also made me wonder, like, wait, what books are you reading? Because he's reading novels, I wonder.
Oh, probably some. Yeah, I think
he's Tristram Shandy. I know that.
Yeah.
Like that's
there's
like satirical works that I know he's going to read, but I wonder if he's also reading, love plot, marriage plot novels, and he gets his ideas from this.
I bet. Oh, maybe. I see him in the mix is reading a lot of the Greeks. If by virtue of the fact,
do you think he's a serious reader? He's a classical reader?
Oh, I think he's probably my face freezing is me wondering if I can say slutty in this broadcast, but we're a couple minutes ahead of it, so I'm going to say it and then someone will believe me, I guess. I think he's a slutty reader. I think he'll read, like, there's that veracity. I think he'll read what's before him. For me, I wonder if there's some like Greek and stuff in the mix because it's so far removed from the quotidian of his daily life. It's so elevated that for me, I wonder if that gives him a sense of this is all so meaningless because we're talking about things on a great and grand epic scale in the world of my mind. I think it gives grandeur to the smallness of how little he participates in his life. Yeah, I know. Here's another one of those moments I would love to have be working on an adaptation and talking with a smart actor playing Mr. Bennet, because I'd love to know, do you have any positive intent in this moment? Yeah. Is it a game? Because he acknowledges too that he sees that his wife is making a hash of it and making Jane very unhappy with, talking about it all the time. He acknowledges that. Is there any positive intent of, I acknowledge that she's being terrible about this, not to the point he'll do anything or try and curb it or try and fix it, but there seems to be, I don't know, an inability or a choice to get in the mix domestically and in these situations. And he seems to acknowledge, yes, I see that my wife is making you unhappy. Yes, I see that Jane is unhappy. I'm making a joke of it. So is it meanness or is it trying to acknowledge and being stunted in it? There's a painful moment happening. I'm going to make light of it because I don't know how to do anything else.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm interested in that.
That's hitting very close to my personal life.
Sorry.
I've done this, I've been in a house with, not clearly, my wife's not a Mrs. Bennet, but I've been in a house with all these daughters and how, things can get really crazy. And here I am sitting, my wife's probably watching it. I think she's watching tonight's episode. And here I am, sitting up here in my study all the time doing my work. And there is a part of my life that is very much like Mr. Bennet. It's like Dad's in his study, Dad's, reading his books and doing his thing there. And so there is a kind of desire to, like, could you please keep your craziness, to yourself? I'm trying to do this. But I'm also very involved in my kids' lives and what they're going through and doing that kind of thing. So I don't, but that's because I'm here now in the 21st century, the 21st century with my kids. Like, were I in Mr. Bennet's time, why on earth would I be involved in my daughter's lives? Like, why on earth would I ever think that that is an activity that I should be involved with? Because that's the reality of Mr. Bennet's time, is that, you don't involve yourself in your children's lives, especially your daughter's lives. The fact that he has, raised, the fact that he has a Lizzie who reads and who is interested in the kind of things, the way of looking at the world that he is almost a triumph enough for him. And I also think of Austen's life. I think of Jane Austen's life and her father, being a clergyman and being an important part of the community in that way, and their kind of moral guidance, but also knowing that even as he's running this like boys' school in his house, that his daughters read voraciously and read all the books that he reads, and he gives them that freedom to explore the literary world that is a little unusual for Austen's time.
Yeah.
And
it feels interesting that I think, to further evidence to your excellent point of like, he has a Lizzie, and that's a special thing. He directs this to Lizzie and not to Jane. It doesn't seem to give Jane any pain, but me in 2022, if I were going through an emotional turmoil, having the love of my life left me here, and my dad was like to a sister, like, yeah, that looks rough. Instead of dealing with me, like, I have feelings about that. Yeah, it's clear to me how much he singles Lizzie out. And if there is positive intent, it feels like the apology, if there is an apology, is to Lizzie for his lack of engagement.
Well, all righty. Wickham shows up at the end of this chapter too. Wickham's society was of material service in dispelling the gloom which the late perverse occurrences had thrown on many of the Longbourn family. Wickham's there all the time. And it's also was now added that of general unreserve in Wickham. Like I'm talking about Darcy and my life to everybody. It's now openly acknowledged and publicly canvassed. Everybody knows about this. And Jane is the only one who thinks that there might be extenuaing circumstances.
And
Jane's the one who gives the benefit of the doubt here.
And okay, then maybe as we've gotten as far as the novel, like Jane is again giving too much credit to Mr. Darcy, that he should be pilloried publicly for not following the wishes of his conscience and his father's dictates. But it is worth pointing out that Wickham did say when he told Lizzie that he would, in honor of the father, never put it out there, never shame Darcy. So why does all of
far be it from me to say anything? And then he goes on and says everything to everybody all the time. Yeah.
Right. And I think we're first time readers. I think we're supposed to clock that. I think we are.
All righty. Chapter 25, we get some of this lovely, funny, satirical lovemaking of Mr. Collins again. After a week spent in professions of love and schemes of felicity, Mr. Collins was called from his amiable Charlotte by the arrival of Saturday. The pain of separation, however, might be alleviated on his side by preparations for the reception of his bride. I mean, it's, Austen really goes over the top in describing Mr. Collins in love.
Mm-hmm.
But the Gardiners arrive now to spend Christmas at Longbourn, which is fun. That it is, and as we're doing this show, we are nearing Christmas. And although we get nothing about Christmas being celebrated, which is like, I know what readers now want. Like, oh, I wish we saw how they celebrated Christmas. This is how they celebrate it. The Gardiners come and they all go out to parties everywhere.
Yeah, if I could sidebar for a second, we talked about my upcoming Tiny Dynamite event last episode, Home for the Holidays, happening at the Georgian Mansion, the Powell House here in Philly this coming weekend. There is a room dedicated to holiday traditions, as well as a room dedicated to theatricalization of some moments from literature where the holidays come up. And yeah, when you're in the Regency, there's not much. In Home for the Holidays, we take the scene where Emma's at a Christmas Eve party where she finally figures out that she is Mr. Ellen's object. But yeah, Christmas is in this period not that big a deal.
Yeah.
I know sometimes readers are confused that like, wait, the kids didn't come for Christmas with the Gardiners?
Yes.
So
'Cause
weird.
we learn that later when Elizabeth
Yeah.
then goes to London. The kids are there. Why aren't the kids coming to Christmas at Longbourn?
Because Christmas is all about eating. It's like it's parties, social engagement, food. Presents are not
A
even really a
family
thing.
holiday that Dickens will kind of,
Yeah.
help create.
Dickens and Prince Albert, thank you for your Germanic traditions. Like it's in the Victorian era that Christmas will become more of what we know it to be as like a major celebration. Yeah, the Puritanism that influenced over the mid 18th century and into the Regency period, just it wasn't that big a deal.
It's not even expected that it should be a family holiday at this time where children would go with you. And, there clearly would be some places that would have traditions for this time of the year they would be doing. But the Longbourn tradition is pretty much just that Mrs. Bennet's brother, Mr. Gardiner, comes with his wife, Mrs. Gardiner, who never gets a first name in this novel. And they just spend the holiday never having a family dinner, which means that they were just out every night, going in town and dining at other places,
or having people over so that it's a big dinner at the house. No, I gotta believe,
and the officers over and all of that. So
Mrs. Bennet's gotta be like loving Christmas is her element, right? It's a big food holiday. She is a food hostess. I look to her for information.
Let's mention quickly here too that Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, gentlemanlike man, greatly superior to his sister, Mrs. Bennet, as well by nature as education. And that he's it says the Netherfield ladies would have had difficulty in believing that a man who lived by trade and within view of his own warehouses could have been so well bred and agreeable, which I think is funny. Like, they wouldn't acknowledge that he was a gentleman anyway, or had gentlemanly behavior, because he's not a gentleman. He works for a living. He is in trade.
Like their dad was, ladies of Netherfield. They have very short memories.
Yes. And Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was an amiable, intelligent, elegant woman and a great favorite with her Longbourn nieces. And also they had frequently been staying with her in town, which is interesting because we've talked so much about how isolated they are. And there's one sentence here that lets us know that they frequently, and probably Elizabeth and Jane mostly, have gone to town, meaning London, with Mrs. Gardiner. So they have not been, completely isolated in meeting people in their young lives so far. But also I want to point out that Mrs. She could literally be late 20s, probably closer to in her 30s, but she's not an older woman in this novel.
Yeah. I am.
That Mr. Gardiner has gotten a young, good-looking, wife is what he has gotten, because he's wealthy.
He's rich and charming, and well-read. All that's hot. That's on the list.
Mrs. Gardiner, Aunt Gardiner here, I should just mention just quickly that, Mrs. Bennet's happy and very glad to hear what you tell us of long sleeves. Like, there's this fashion element too that Mrs. Gardiner's bringing to the people of the country that I can talk to you about, London fashions, which is very important to these women who are living in the country, for them to dress well and to hear about. But what Mrs. Gardiner specifically wants to talk to Lizzie about is Jane and Bingley and then Wickham. But first, it's, she challenges Elizabeth on Jane being violently in love with, she says, pray how violent was Mr. Bingley's love. She, is, she's very pragmatic, Mrs. Gardiner, I think, in this scene here, that like she understands how to play the game, how to get a husband, what's at stake in reputation, and what you have to gain by a good marriage. And she's bringing this to play in talking to maybe her favorite niece. So
I'd extend that. She understands the world we're in. And I like her as a model of not only wisdom, but playfulness. She begins this conversation by saying, look, I know you're not so silly a girl that me saying don't run into his arms will make you run into his arms.
Yeah.
But there's a playfulness to that wisdom that I really like about her. It gives me a sense of like, oh, in temperament, who might Lizzie become? Feels like there's a lot of Mrs. Gardiner in that. Someone as effervescent as she is grounded. What a combo. I also, one of the things I love about the idea of Mrs. Gardiner in conversation with Mrs. Bennet is that the only wisdom that Mrs. Bennet values in Mrs. Gardiner is fashion. When in the next couple of scenes, we get a view of Mrs. Gardiner who's filled with perspective and wisdom and thoughtfulness and guidance for how a young girl, like the 5 that she has as nieces, should move through the world. And Mrs. Bennet wants to put no authority in anything else that Mrs. Gardiner has to give.
Yeah.
So it's not just that we value fashion, it's that we value only fashion from Mrs. Gardiner, who is filled with other stuff.
Because she's talking to Lizzie about things that Mrs. Bennet should be talking to her about, and I think she knows that Mrs. Bennet isn't talking. She knows that Lizzie's mother isn't talking to her about this stuff, and that she better, as the good aunt.
Yeah, there's a lot of cleaning up the messes from
there. So she decides that it'll be a good idea if Jane comes to London, and interesting enough, because she thinks not that Jane should come to London because maybe she could meet Bingley. Mrs. Gardiner thinks that Jane should come to London because there's no way she'll meet him because we're in Gracechurch Street. They're not going to associate with us. But Elizabeth hopes that it might lead to something. And that is a clear difference. But also the other thing that Mrs. Gardiner brings up is about Wickham, and that she sees danger in Elizabeth liking Wickham. The text says, Mr. Wickham was sure to be one as the people at the party, and on these occasions, Mrs. Gardiner, rendered suspicious by Elizabeth's warm commendation of him, narrowly observed them both. Their preference to each other was plain enough to make her a little uneasy, and she resolved to speak to Elizabeth on the subject before she left Herefordshire, and represent to her the imprudence of encouraging such an attachment.
Yeah. And Lizzie's like, well, I can't make any promises.
So then when they talk, she's like, you are too sensible a girl, Lizzie, to fall in love merely because you are warned against it, but be on your guard. Be on your guard. Do not involve yourself or endeavor to involve him in an affection which the want of fortune would make so very imprudent. She says, I have nothing to say against him. If he had the fortune he ought to have, I should think you could not do better. But she's telling Elizabeth, don't get involved with Wickham because he's got no money and no prospects for really getting
Compare that to the last chapter where Lizzie's like, it's unaccountable for Charlotte to marry Mr. Collins, right? So Lizzie has a very extreme view of like, don't marry for material gain. And yet Mrs. Gardiner, who everything in the novel says, oh, this is a person we can trust, says, don't ignore material gain or you will be very sorry. That there is always in I just love that that's back to back in these chapters of this like I don't know, you hit the side walls of the extremes, and it's like Austen is sending us toward a more measured centrist view of some of these things of yeah, think about all of it, don't marry a Mr. Collins, but think about all of it, that I believe we're meant to trust, that feels to me very close to Austen's own value system. Yeah.
This whole conversation too, between the two of them, really, I mean, Elizabeth's got all these flippant responses, about like, oh, don't worry, like I don't, thing, and but it also, and then she's like, young people, Elizabeth's like, yeah, well, young people fall in love, so how can I be sure I won't, and it's all Jocelyn Harris, keyed me into this, that this is a very Shakespearean response in a sense. It's all like, this is right out of Midsummer Night, As You Like It, Much Ado, like this
Romeo and Juliet. I would look to like if looking liking move, Juliet said.
There you go. That's what this like Elizabeth's trying to like play light in this conversation, and Mrs. Gardiner's trying to remind her that like, well, maybe this isn't the comedy, maybe this is Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
Like, you better be careful here.
Yeah. It doesn't end with the marriage, kiddo. Like, we got to like see it through to the end time. Yeah. I also think there's we've been talking about Lizzie's sometimes lack of self-knowledge. And I think here's a nice, she's flippant about it, but also like, I mean, don't expect me to be better than any other young people. I hear what you're saying is right, but I don't know if I can do it. Has a kind of wisdom in it too, of like, I will listen to what you say, but may still make my mistakes. Yeah. Oh.
I'd like that Elizabeth's also like, oh, I mean, like, I'm not in a hurry, like, I'm not really that into Wickham, and her aunt points out that, well, maybe you shouldn't remind your mother of inviting him to, every time to come over. And Elizabeth's like, all right, you called me out. And we have to be reminded here too, well, as reminded that we've had in previous chapters, that Elizabeth's really into Wickham. She really likes him. She really thinks that there's a possibility here. She has mentioned already that, or it has been mentioned to us already, that she was happy to have him come over and introduce him to her parents in the beginning, that there's something, she thinks that there could be something here with the two of them.
But she does not respond with violence of affection of her own.
Yes.
She's like making jokes. She doesn't say, but Aunt, I love him, So I think there's a little bit of external circumstance that's forcing her to recognize how she really
makes it a point that like, that she's not like Jane feeling towards Bingley. Like, and Elizabeth knows that this is a fun thing to do at her age. And this is why her aunt is warning her, is because like, you got to be careful about that kind of fun thing to do at your age, to flirt with a guy, because there are consequences to this.
My bud.
There's the point.
There he is. Stay there, stay in your place. Yeah. And the fact that she can hear that, I think, does tell us and makes her admit to herself that there are limits to how strongly she feels about him. She might have, in the quiet of her mind, enjoyed the indulgence of fancying herself in love. This is something that comes up with Emma as well. Emma has no one to talk to, and occasionally then fan love because it feels good to play those games. But when external forces, like an aunt she trusts and loves and respects, is like, be careful. And she's like, yeah, I'm good. I'm fine. I've been indulging. I'm fine.
Well, the wedding takes place, Mr. Collins and Charlotte, and I'm a little, I'm a little bummed that Austen didn't add a little more, like, to that wedding. Like, we see Mr. Collins being the ridiculous person that he is in a wedding, but she doesn't. And because what's more important here is that Elizabeth could never address her, Charlotte, without feeling that all the comfort of intimacy was over. And though determined not to slacken as a correspondent to write to her, it was for the sake of what she had been rather than what was, that Elizabeth recognizes that, well, thinks at this moment that like, oh man, my friendship with Charlotte is really over.
That is harsh, Lizzie. Yeah. That is too harsh. I hope you think better of it somehow at some time. I'm not saying she even does. Yeah, it's harsh. Not everyone thinks like you. Lizzie Bennet, I love you super.
These
a
are
lot.
things that we'll address next week when Elizabeth gets to visit the Hunsford Parsonage for
I think
Charlotte.
even in the lead up, even in the, she dreaded it. It's not what she wanted. It was more what Charlotte wanted. But as it got closer, she's like, well, it's better than hanging out here with my sisters. So I think she even starts to soften here in these chapters toward, I want to see Charlotte. I'm interested in this trip. There's novelty in it. Okay, let's go.
All righty. Jane has not heard from Caroline Bingley, and Jane thinks probably because her letter has been lost.
Sure.
As
Sure
she's, Jane's in. I'm sorry. Jane now goes to London with the Gardiners, and she's there, and they'll like, oh my gosh, I haven't heard from Caroline because probably the letter I sent her was lost. Jane's thinking the best of her. And then, but what we get is Caroline sends Jane a letter then, and she visits her, and sends her a letter that we really, Jane finally gets she finally sees through Caroline, and knows that, she is not, being good to her. And we get like these quotations from a letter, which I really want to go into today. Well, all right, we'll talk about it a little bit, even though we're going way over time.
And I just want to say, when at the end of our session last week, we're like, not much happens in 24 to 27. I know. What will we talk about?
I was like, and then I read these and I'm like, oh my God, these chapters are so vital. And I didn't think they were vital when I was like forming the whole thing. I thought like, I want to talk about this, that, and the other thing. And there's so much vital stuff that happens in these and they are, because they very much are transitional chapters in plot, as to like moving people along, but we get these key moments that happen for these characters, and they talk about their feelings and what they think about what happens. And here, one of the key things is Carolyn gets this letter from, Jane gets this letter from Carolyn where she's like, first Elizabeth gets a letter from Jane telling her about this. And she's quoting the letter that she's gotten from Caroline, and it's also the importance of letters in this novel too. There's it's like 40 some letters in the novel that we get either in whole or part or described, and this is one of the reasons why, especially scholars, think that this was originally an epistolary novel, and that Austen kind of refashioned it, because letters are so important in this novel.
It's good stuff. Like, don't throw it away. Yeah. Yeah. And
what Jane learns is that, Miss Bingley, from her letter, that she's, that Caroline writes to her about, Charles is really, he's going to marry Georgiana, and we all want him to marry Georgiana, but also with the visits that Jane visits Caroline, and she gives a short shrift, and then Caroline Bingley plays a very short visit to Jane, in which she realizes that you don't really like me and want to give me the time of day.
I would love to point something out to readers who might not know this, is that morning in the Regency, that's not up till noon. That's up till dinner. That's up till 4 or 5 p.m. So for 2 weeks, Jane Bennet waited at home in London, where the shopping is good, waited at home every day until 5 p.m. for 2 weeks for this friend to show up, and doesn't. Yeah, she's had 2 long weeks to face the truth about how she's been treated.
It wasn't 2 weeks, it was a fortnight.
What is that, not 2 weeks?
It is 2 weeks. I'm just saying that's the terminology. It's a fortnight. It's so important. I have to use a British term for it. It was a fortnight. Every
day she wait. Of course, she has to confront who Caroline Bingley really is, because it's been every day. Yeah, it's terrible.
And then we find out that Wickham is that Elizabeth tells Mrs. Gardiner that Wickham is now interested in this girl Miss King, who has inherited 10,000 pounds, and his apparent partiality had subsided. Wickham's partiality to Elizabeth had subsided. His attentions were over. He was the admirer of someone else. Elizabeth was watchful enough to see it all, but she could see it and write of it. But she could see it and write of it without material pain. Her heart had been but slightly touched, and her vanity was satisfied with believing that she would have been his only choice had fortune permitted it. She could sincerely wish him happy. Elizabeth gets the kind of reminder that, like, as soon as Wickham says, suddenly he's not coming around anymore because he's hanging out with Miss King, that Elizabeth realizes that, I guess I really wasn't that into you.
Yeah.
That she could sincerely wish him happy. I wonder if that isn't a kind of free and direct, is like her point of view, and like maybe she really is, but I think that she's not that into Wickham.
Yeah, maybe. I think that the structurally the thing most interesting to me is, given the depth of Jane's pain, it's one of the things Mrs.
Can you read this? Can you
Yeah.
read the end of that chapter 26? Because it's a quotation right from her letter to Mrs. Gardiner. It's all this acknowledged to Mrs. Gardiner after relating the circumstances. She thus went on. And then it's quoting from Jane's letter, quoting from Elizabeth's letter.
Yes, give me where you want me to start.
I am now convinced.
Oh,
That is the very end of chapter 26. Go ahead.
I am now, okay, do you want it in dialect? All right. I'm now convinced, my dear aunt, that I have never been much in love, for had I really experienced that pure and elevating passion, I should at present detest his very name and wish him all manner of evil. But my feelings are not only cordial towards him, they are even impartial towards Miss King. I cannot find out that I hate her at all, or that I am in the least unwilling to think her a very good sort of girl. There can be no love in all of this. My watchfulness has been effectual, and though I certainly should be a more interesting object to my acquaintances were I distractedly in love with him, I cannot say that I regret my comparative insignificance. Importance may sometimes be purchased too dearly.
I think she reveals much more in that than we're supposedly led to believe, that she is hurt by this.
Well,
because I hear that satirical bent in there, and that to me reads as, I'm covering up what I'm feeling.
I can buy that interpretation for sure. I also, for me, is weighed with, given what Mrs. Gardiner says, is I wish, when she was talking about Bingley and Jane, I wish it had been you, Lizzie, you would have laughed yourself out of it. So yeah, let's assume for a second, like, she really is touched and hurt, and who wouldn't be? He's very handsome. He's paid you a lot of invitation, and all of a sudden he's gone. Like, no one wants to be weighed and found wanting, especially since you're counting on the fact that not having a dowry, your charm is going to make you really attractive to people. That your charm wore thin is, okay, I can believe you. I can get with you on that end. But yes, what we're seeing, if that's the case, we're seeing what Mrs. Gardiner says. She's laughing herself out of it. I'm also interested in structurally, right, the depth of Jane's pain versus whether Lizzie is touched or not, her ability to laugh herself out. So certainly we're looking at two very different types of attachment.
Because the next chapter, then chapter 27, she says, when her and Wickham say farewell to each other, because Elizabeth's going off to London to see Jane and then to visit Charlotte, she says, the farewell between herself and Mr. Wickham was perfectly friendly, on his side even more. His present pursuit could not make him forget that Elizabeth had been the first to excite and deserve his attention, the first to listen and to pity, the first to be admired. And that kind of, this is about him, but she knows that this is about her too. Like, this is her part in his life, that this attachment was maybe a little stronger than she's letting on that it might have been or not.
Certainly what I hear is a guy having made his choice for some other woman.
Yeah,
still
maybe
sees
that's
that
all him
first
there. It's
woman
not to do with her.
fawn over him. Oh yeah, I've been the girl not chosen plenty of times, enough to be reminded of, well, I still want you to want me. And I'm like, no, no. And so Lizzie's a better person than I that doesn't
He
like
must always be her model of the amiable and pleasing. So this is what
she's a better woman
told that she thinks of him. Yeah. So maybe not. I'd love that these questions get raised in my head, that like, how much is she really attached to him? And, perhaps not so much. And she certainly is convinced that not so much.
We are invited to question first impressions all the time. We are invited to question what characters say about themselves. Yeah. We're invited to question even like their private thoughts of who they think they are in those moments. Yeah, I love that you and I sometimes see these moments differently, because there's room for all of it. Yeah. Because within those boundaries, all of those things they're all up for grabs. Jane Austen is inviting us to reconsider how much these characters really know themselves, how honest they're being about the situations they're in. Yep.
Thank you for bringing that first impressions up for everybody. That's the original title for this novel. That's what Jane Austen had called it originally. First Impressions was her first draft of this novel, and it's those first impressions. Jane goes to London. Or I keep saying Jane is.
That would have been another good title for this novel.
Yeah,
Jane goes to London.
Elizabeth goes to London and she visits the Gardiners, where in their house all was joy and kindness. They spent their morning in bustle and shopping, and the evening at one of the theaters. Elizabeth sits with her aunt and talks about Jane and how she's, getting on, because, Jane's been with, her Aunt Gardiner now. And they then have this, Mrs. Gardiner was and Jane talk, or Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth talk about Elizabeth and how it's okay for Wickham to be interested in Miss King, and we get this kind of double standard here now from Elizabeth, where she was at first with Charlotte saying like, no, you shouldn't be mercenary and marrying, and now she's like, yeah, with Wickham that's fine, that he should be mercenary and look for a fortune in a partner. And Elizabeth sounding a bit soured on relationships here. Is this because because Wickham jilted her? She says I have a very poor opinion of young men who live in Derbyshire. No, this is Elizabeth. And their intimate friends who live in Herefordshire are not much better. I am sick of them all. Thank heaven I am going tomorrow, where I shall find a man who has not one agreeable quality, who has neither manners nor sense to recommend him. This is Mr. Collins. Stupid men are the only ones worth knowing after all. And that's another thing that gets me, like, she was thinking of Wickham as a potential, and then suddenly he was gone, and now Elizabeth is a little bit annoyed by that.
All boys are dumb. Yeah.
Well, and they are.
Yeah. There's certainly a danger of her indulging in too many qualities of her father's, in disconnecting from the world when there's been a disappointment. I also think she's not forgotten the beautiful indulgence of being pissed at Bingley, and then by extension, the great villain of the novel.
Yeah, that's all part
Darcy.
of it.
Yeah, right. He's always there, Mr. Darcy, ready to be made a villain of. Think on.
Well, Mrs. Gardiner invites Elizabeth to go on a trip with the two of them, with Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, to the lake country in the summer, a tour of pleasure, which they propose taking in the summer. And Elizabeth is like, oh my, and then she has this paragraph that is kind of a little parodying of, romantic sensibility in the country, but she delivered these lines that are great. Adieu to disappointment and spleen? What are men to rocks and mountains?
Mountains. One of my favorite. Well, maybe one of the lines I quote the most.
What a great line. What are men to rock? What are men to rocks and mountains? Is, a very legitimate question to ask.
A friend was telling me a breakup story just recently, and I think I said it. I think I said it to her over beers. What are men to rocks and mountains? Yeah. So I think that's another thing. Mrs. Gardiner is right. Yes, there's a souring, there's a disappointment here, but she manages to laugh herself out of it and find the good and find pleasure and find perspective and make a joke of herself. So I wish her luck in the Lake District.
Great. Well, that's what we'll find out next week. And J Knights, thank you all for tuning in today. Thanks to our show sponsor, Lisa Washington. Thanks to all of you who have donated over the last week and really since the beginning of this show. Your support helps us bring this show to everyone, create other one-of-a-kind programs and courses, and helps us care for the collections at the Rosenbach. And I want to thank Pauline C. from Morganville. I know Pauline well. She's been in several courses as well. From Morganville, New Jersey, who made a generous donation. And you can also become a member of the Rosenbach, as did Lindsay S. from Percy, PA, and Belinda D. from Cannon Hill. And it said, when I looked at the thing, it said Cannon Hill, it was like QSL or QSD or something. I was like, what the heck is that? Cannon Hill is a suburb of Brisbane in Queensland, Australia. Who became a member for watching this and from watching this show.
That's amazing.
That's really nice. Rosenbach membership gives you free museum admission, and which, if you're ever here, Belinda, I hope you will visit us. Discounts on, but it also gives you discounts on programs and courses, many of which are virtual, and exclusive invitations to members only events. You can learn more about how to become a member on our website. Everyone, remember, we have an Austen Mondays Facebook group where you can look us up and continue the conversation. And also go to the Rosenbach's YouTube account where you're watching this now, but like the Austen Mondays videos and leave comments there too. Subscribe to the channel. That's all. That's great. That raises our visibility online. Thanks to Brianna, who was our chat Mrs. Reynolds, for managing our links in the chat. Thanks to Jessica Bedford and UKC for taking a turn about the room with us today. Next week on episode 10, Patricia A. Matthew will be our guest to talk about how Austen is reimagined for the 21st century audiences. And then I won't have you for a chapter co-host after 2 weeks in a row, but I will have Dr. Lauren Nixon here to talk about chapters 28 to 31, Dining at Rosen's. Yes, we will have the pleasure, the very distinct honor with an O-U-R ending too, the honor of experiencing the affability and condescension of the Right Honorable Lady Catherine de Bourgh.
I can't wait to hear how her mantelpiece is described.
Do you know that the chimney piece alone cost 800 pounds?
Yes, I've heard that. Yeah.
Well, rest assured, I will temper with silence my wit and vivacity when meeting Lady Catherine de Bourgh. So
please don't.
Thank you, Casey.
All right.
Thanks to Tucker Christine, who wrote our opening and closing credits music. Thanks to my daughter Lulu, who shot and created the credits with me. Farewell, readers. What are men to rocks and mountains? Bye-bye.